Peatland Restoration Officer with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and she's here to tell us why it is so vital to give peat a chance. So please welcome Jenny Sharman.
Thank you very much, Ken. My goodness, I think that's the first time I've ever been called distinguished. Yes, so I'm Jenny Sharman, and I'm a project officer for the Pennine Peat Life project, which is a pan-organisation project across the Yorkshire Dales, the Forest of Bowland, and the North Pennines AONB. And it's supported by all these organisations. Now, beyond this project, I work for the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, which is under the auspices of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And the majority of my work is in the Yorkshire Dales and Nidderdale AONB. So the title of this is Give Peat a Chance. And hopefully by the end of this, that's exactly what you'll want to do. So before I get into the detail of the presentation, I wanted to show you a few pictures that I hope will explain why Yorkshire Peat Partnership needs to do what it does. So first up, what you see in this picture is what a relatively healthy peatland in Yorkshire should look like. It's full of life, it's covered with cotton grasses and sphagnum, which is that beautiful green stuff right in the sort of front of the picture. Now, what you might also be able to gather from this is that peatlands are a type of wetland. But what the photo can't tell you is that peatlands are not simply a habitat, they're also among the most valuable ecosystems on Earth. They're critical for preserving global biodiversity, providing safe drinking water, minimizing flood risk, and helping us to address climate change. So they really do perform a lot of roles for us. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. But I just wanted to show you in the next few slides why peatlands are so in need of our protection. The picture that you saw previously, as I said, is what we want in Yorkshire. Unfortunately, this picture here is more of what we've got. Areas are just stripped of their vegetation, exposing bare peat to erosion from water and wind. And it's worst when it starts to form these deeply cut channels of flowing water full of peaty sediment that are all on its way to our rivers and streams. So if you can imagine all of that peat that's just eroded and it just ends up in our rivers and streams. And I'm now going to give you a fact that will put all of this into perspective. Peat forms at the incredibly slow pace of 1 millimeter a year. So what you see here in this picture is a 3 to 4 meter high gully that is on a daily basis losing peat that was formed 4,000 years ago, if not more. So I'm going to give you another critical fact. Peat stores more carbon than all of the world's rainforests. It's actually the greatest terrestrial store of carbon in the world. And what you see here in this picture is the daily loss of that carbon readily going up into the atmosphere and into our rivers and streams and contributing substantially to climate change. And there's actually a really shocking statistic that's going around that we lose more carbon from peatlands in this country than we do from our oil refineries. So really important stuff. Now, just to bring it home even more, this is a photo of a 4 meter deep peat gully in Yorkshire. And again, just remember, it takes a year for peat to build up to 1 millimeter of thickness. So again, what you're looking at here is actually 4,000 years worth of peat that's been eroded away, and probably just in the last 100 or so years. And all of that carbon has just been released. What you're also looking at, though, is a layer of history from 4,000 years ago that's now beginning to decompose. So if you just look at the bottom of the picture, you'll see what looks like a normal log, a bit of cut wood. That is from 4,000, if not more, years ago. It's the remains of a tree, and in fact, it's several trees that lie underneath all that peat that form the base layer. This suggests that something happened 4,000 to 6,000 years ago that led to the disappearance of trees on this site. Perhaps it was a wetter climate that caused the trees to die, or it might have been a change in land management, or perhaps both, that just resulted in the trees being cut down and the peat began to form on top of it. And then another much more recent change in land management in the last 100 years that has led to the utter destruction of this slowly formed soil. And if you look at this is the valley at the bottom there. You can see the tiny bit of wood that I took the photograph of. But just look at this gully and imagine the amount of water that it must have taken and wind to come down there to strip away all of that vegetation and to create those gullies. And if you think about that water that's coming off, where is it going? It's going into our valleys, it's going into our rivers, and at an enormous rate, which is adding to all of our flood risk. So just one gully summarizes so many of the reasons why we need to give peat a chance. So let's get back to the main story. What exactly is peat? So peat is a soil that's formed of partially decomposed plant material. It forms in areas that are really waterlogged, creating conditions that are really highly acidic and deficient in oxygen. And that's what leads to these plants decaying so incredibly slowly. And it's those decaying plants that form the peat. So peat is made up of these dead and very, very slowly decaying plant material. And the plant material itself very commonly covers the surface of the peat, like the sphagnum moss that you see here. So these species of moss are the primary building blocks of peat, with very unique properties in themselves. First of all, they're very acidic. So they take all of their nutrients from the rain and actually hold up to 20 times their weight in water, which means that they can readily absorb all of that runoff, or a lot of the runoff that's on the hills. The rate of decay of these plants is extremely slow, partly due to the acidity, as I said, but also due to the waterlogged conditions, which means there's very little oxygen present. The results are in peat retaining this plant material as carbon. So in its natural state, a peatland like the one you see here is full of carbon. In fact, while only 3% of the Earth's surface is covered in peat, they contain over 30% of the world's carbon found in soil. So there's approximately 400 million hectares of peatlands across the globe, in 180 countries in every continent. They vary from the forested peatlands in Europe to tropical swamp forests in Southeast Asia, to Russian and Canadian areas of permafrost, and to the mountains of the Andes and the Himalayas. But the majority of peatlands globally lie in the Northern Hemisphere. In the UK, peatlands cover over 3 million hectares. The majority of this lies in the Highlands and Moorlands of Scotland, the Pennines, Wales, Dartmoor and Exmoor, with small areas of lowland peat in the East Anglian Fens. They cover about 10% of our land area, but they store about 3 billion tons of carbon, which is equivalent to all our forests, plus all the forests of Germany and France put together. So I guess you could say that peatlands are our Amazon. So this map shows where the Yorkshire Peat Partnership works, mostly the Yorkshire Dales, Nidderdale A and B, and North York Moors, with pockets in the Forest of Bowland and a small area around Calderdale. And this is my stomping ground in the Yorkshire Dales and Nidderdale. In our patch, we have an estimated 95,000 hectares that has the potential to contain peat soils. We've surveyed nearly half of that area, over 120 different sites, and based on these findings, predicts that we have about 63,000 hectares that will be actually peaty soils, and the majority will be classed as deep peat, which means there's at least 40 centimetres of peat. So in a happy peatland landscape in Yorkshire, we'd be looking at scenery that would appear something like this. This is known as blanket bog. And while it's the most common type of peatland found in the uplands of the UK, it's in fact globally really rare. 13% of this type of peatland is found in the UK, so it's of international importance. Blanket bogs, as I've said, are highly acidic with nutrient-poor soils supporting typical bog vegetation like this sphagnum and these cotton grasses. These plants are all dependent on precipitation for their survival. Now, there are two other types of peatland in the UK. There are raised bogs, which are found mainly in the lowlands. And these are areas of peat that actually rise above the surrounding landscape. And this is a picture that was taken on Hatfield Moor in the Humberhead levels. They're also only fed by precipitation, so they've got similar kind of acidic and nutrient-poor properties. And so the bog vegetation looks very similar to what we have in the uplands. But thirdly, you have fenlands, and you can tell from this picture they're slightly different in that they're not only fed by rainfall, but they're also fed from the nutrients and the underlying geology of the land. So the soils tend to be richer, and you'll find these sedges and reeds and brown mosses. And this sort of area is in East Anglia. So let's move on to why we actually need to be a bit worried about what's going on. As with many conservation issues, it's sadly humans and the way we manage our land that's caused peatlands to turn from a functioning blanket bog to the broken landscape that you see here. Now, I need to say that there's no blame here for past land management. No one's actually deliberately gone out to cause this, of course, but it's something that's happened through various policies, historical policies and actions. And it's now that we recognize that the land actually can't sustain the kind of management that we've been throwing at it. And so we're all having to learn as we go along and make these mistakes that actually we now need to start moving in a different direction. So the main problem is management that's resulted in the disappearance of the vegetation that you see here. So the sphagnums and cotton grasses and the crowberry that's all in the foreground, but you've got the eroded peat in the background there. And slowly, slowly, all of that vegetation that you see in the foreground is just going to disappear because of the amount of water that's actually coming down. So as I mentioned earlier, peat is made up of the vegetation that lies above it, these beautiful sphagnum mosses, the cotton grasses, the dwarf shrubs, but mostly it's made up from sphagnum. And if you take away that vegetation, it exposes the peat beneath it to oxygen, to water, and to wind. And all of those will destroy the fabric of the peat beneath. It's then subject to erosion, and it can very easily just dry up and be washed away. So once you set that process of erosion in motion, this is what happens on the ground. You'll have vast areas of bare peat begin to form as the surface runoff and the wind attack the exposed peat layer. Steadily, the water and the wind traveling over the surface begin to cut out deeper and deeper sections of peat, creating what's known as hags, while the channels are gouged out into these horrendous gullies. All of this increase in water that's leaving the land leads to it drying out even further, killing off even more vegetation and accelerating the process even more. So it's this really terrible downward spiral. Once it's kicked off, you've got no hope really. So there are three main causes of this breakdown in Yorkshire's peatlands. Firstly, it's drainage, and that's particularly from these ditches or so-called grits that were put in after World War II to try to increase the area for sheep grazing. So of course, back then we wanted to produce as much food as possible. So we needed as much land as we could, get as many sheep up there as possible. And it worked really well. It did what it said on the tin, and it's drained the land and the sheep were able to get up there. But the problem was that as soon as they did, sheep themselves can actually be very damaging. So sorry, I'll just go back to this slide, which is a slide, this is a grip that's actually been eroded so deep, I could stand in it and it was above my head when I was standing in it. So it just goes to show again, the amount of water that's coming through there, channeling it. They do work. So we get the sheep coming on the land. And the problem there is that they, as well as nibbling away at the vegetation, and if there are too many sheep on the land and they begin to overgraze, it of course strips the vegetation away. But also it's their feet that just hundreds and hundreds of little footsteps all following one another. And as you can see here, there's this channel that's formed, and it's just most likely been from hundreds and hundreds of sheep that over the years have just tread this little path, which has then become eroded and water washing down it. And what you'll see in this picture as well is that there's lots of bits of wood. This was actually an old parish boundary. So it's very, very likely that the sheep, as you know, will huddle up to fence lines and walk fence lines. They'll kind of walk their territory, if you like. And I think that's exactly what's happened here, creating this rather horrible drainage channel. So finally, the third cause is fire. Now, fire is damaging because it can remove the top layer of the vegetation if it's not properly controlled. And it can also cause fire within the peat, which will go on for months and months and months and sort of suddenly pop up in different places. And it really is very damaging, as we've seen on more recently on places like Saddleworth Moor. So this is a picture that just shows how it does sort of strip the vegetation away. And this one here, this was a beautiful sphagnum hummock, which, as you can see, just looks very beleaguered now, and it's probably not going to survive. So a great shame, really. So with only 20% of the UK's peatlands thought to still be in a near natural state, the impact of this kind of degradation is actually really quite widespread and very severe. UK's peatlands should actually be sequestering over 3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, but instead they're thought to be emitting 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. So they've gone from being this wonderful carbon sink to actually a source of carbon. And with no vegetation to help slow the flow of water off the hills and the free flowing channels through the grips and the gullies, valleys directly below are often subjected to flash floods. And you can see here below one of my sites on Semmer Water, this farmer's field is regularly flooded. And it's not just the pollution or the flooding that's the problem. This land is also becoming submerged with rocks, many of which have actually come off the moorland, or as the force of the water has come down the hillside, it's just gouged out these huge amounts of rocks and just sprayed them all over the land. And yeah, it causes a huge amount of damage, breaking up walls and destroying tracks. So another really good reason why we need to try to control what's going on up on the hills. Very, very sadly, Summer water itself is beginning to fail in its SSSI status. And one of the reasons is because it's so full of sediment, peaty sediment and minerals that have come off the hills. So finally as well, 70% of the UK's drinking water comes from the upland peatlands. So as well as jeopardizing this resource by destroying peatlands, the increase in the amount of peat that's being washed off these sites has a second massive impact on our ecosystems. Much of that sediment will end up in the becks and the rivers it feeds further down the catchment. And that's why you get that very peaty colour in so many of our rivers. And this can be really, really detrimental to our wildlife that's living in the water. And it's also, to be honest, a massive headache for water companies who have to spend a fortune just cleaning the water before it's suitable to come out of our taps. And of course, that ends up on our bills. So that's another really good reason to protect our peatlands and give peat a chance. So then there's the wildlife and the ecosystem itself. This life force must be at the forefront of our minds when we talk about protecting peatlands. There are so many unique and endangered species that depend on this wilderness for their survival, and its destruction is a major threat to them as well. So starting with the small, like the dragonflies, the large heath butterfly, the emperor moth, and then moving up the food chain. The curlew. It's World Curlew Day today, so a round of applause for the curlew. The rare dunlin and the golden plover. And then of course the vegetation species, like the myriad of beautiful sphagnums and the shrubs. And in pride of place, the magnificent insectivorous sundew. And there's all the reptiles. Might not be so fond of seeing him, but he deserves to be there. The raptors, the amphibians, all the mammals, and then there's my favorite, the short-eared owl. So each one of those little animals and plants are a reason in themselves as to why we need to give peat a chance. So Yorkshire Peat Partnership exists for all of those reasons, to help re-wet, replant, and restore our peatlands, and ensure that all of the services and life it provides will continue. So how do we do it? So one of the first and the most obvious things to do is to block the grips. And this is done using a digger, like the one you see here, to create natural peat buns that effectively dam the grip and instantaneously lead to a buildup of water. All of this will start to seep into the sides of the peat and it will start to re-wet the moor. For wider gullies and channels that have a peat base, we've started to use the same technique to create larger and extremely effective peat buns. So this is actually a technique that we've adapted from lowland restoration practices. And this is a picture showing this cellular bunding at work on the Fens and Wixhall Mosses National Nature Reserve. And we've started to use them on some of the Pennine peat life sites in Yorkshire. And we target these vegetated gullies that have a really good peat base, but clearly a lot of flow. And they range from about 3 meters wide to 5 meters. like this one. And as well as enabling the re-wetting of the surrounding peatlands, we believe that these bunds have a really powerful role to play in flood management, helping to slow the flow and reduce the flashiness of flooding in the surrounding landscape. As you can see, they really do hold back a huge amount of water. And in fact, we've been quite surprised by that. And our digger drivers, as they've been digging, have said that the water has immediately just started backing up. So it just goes to show, you know, how much water does actually come off the land and how much we can actually keep up there, and the difference that that's likely to make. So we don't really know exactly how these bunds will impact the site in the long term, but early signs are so promising. And what we're seeing is the return of this wonderful bog vegetation, like the sphagnums and cotton grasses. Effectively, what's happening here in this picture as well is that you're seeing that this bog vegetation is starting to infill the gullies. So that's another major benefit of what we're doing. So another hydrological technique that's appropriate for peat-based gullies are timber dams. And these are some that have only just been put in. And this shows what happens once they've been in for a few weeks. And as you can see, they can hold back a substantial amount of water, and they work really well in areas where the diggers actually can't get to, or in some areas just where it's simply more appropriate to have them. Now, they work slightly differently to the peat bunds. They're actually termed leaky dams. They take the pressure off the buildup of the water by allowing it to flow over the dam, which you can see that little notch that's cut in the top there, just allows the water to come over when it builds up a bit too much pressure behind it. And they also have just a little bit of opening between the planks that allows water to spill through. But none of that will stop. Well, the dam itself will still prevent the sediment from coming down, which is really, really critical. So while it allows the sort of excess of water, it stops the sediment, and slowly, the sediment will start to build up behind the dam and begins to do this. So again, all of that green is the sphagnum that's returning to that gully and building it up from the base. So when they're done properly and in the right place, these dams work incredibly well to infill the gullies. This is a picture of a dam that had been put in about 5 years ago. You can see we hadn't got exactly the same techniques back then, but it still worked incredibly well, as that is what it looks like today. So you get the idea that it can fill up those gullies with vegetation and help stop that flow. Right, so I have now got my technical challenge to see whether I can share a video with you.
On this site, there's about 8 kilometres worth of eroding gullies that are suitable for timber dams. This amounts to about 1,000 dams across a 100-hectare area. And amazingly, within days, they're doing their job and beginning to change the hydrology of the site.
Well, I think people will be firstly surprised at the amount of water that's actually held up here. Obviously, the amount of rain that's coming down and the water that's held. Villages and small towns that don't have area to hold it, floodplains, just if you don't hold it up here, you can't stop it when it gets downhill. So these timber dams that we're building should hopefully hold off quite a lot of the water and stop flooding downstream.
Josh is one of the team that's been involved in constructing these dams, and I really take my hat off to them. It's not an easy job to do, as the conditions are just so challenging.
Oh well, first and foremost it's the weather really. The weather can be like this, or it can be dire, and you're just facing all different types of weather up here. Obviously carrying big boards of timber around it's quite a struggle with the wind. 50-mile-an-hour plus winds all week, so we'll just have to see how it goes really.
Then there's the peat itself.
Yeah, you're looking a foot deep, if not more in most places, so...
Getting the dams into running channels of water over unstable layers of eroded peat presents its own unique challenge.
Owen keeps falling over, which is brilliant. It lightens the mood a little bit when he's sat down and we're all laughing at him, so...
Well, honestly, you're carrying a bit of wood from literally like 10 metres and you're sinking. And you're like, oh no, this is not the day for it, but it's alright. You get out of it in the end. Get on with it.
Another hydrological method, and we use this in gullies that have actually been eroded so far, they've eroded right the way down to the mineral layer. And the only thing we can really do in this circumstance is to put stone dams in. And they act in a similar way. They slow the flow on the moor, and they trap the sediment behind and allow the vegetation to return. They don't hold as much water as the timber dams, but they're still very effective in building up that sediment layer over time. And as I mentioned, the aim of these techniques, of all these techniques, is to try to build up that gully layer so that one day it'll just all be flat again and covered in vegetation. So finally, the last hydrological technique that we have in our armory are these coir logs. So coir is the husk from a coconut shell, and it's seen to be a sustainable waste product. So where coir logs come into their own is on these flatter areas where there's a definite flow and erosion, but where it would be too difficult or damaging to get to with a machine. You wouldn't really want a digger going in there, churning it up. It would probably also get stuck. So coir are really suitable in these sorts of areas. The idea is to place them so that they break up the area sufficiently to help pull the flow and maximize the collection of sediment, and in so doing, help revegetation. So you can get the idea of that here, where all the site's just been broken up into these smaller little areas. And you'll also see from this that on the right-hand side, that where it's wetter, where there's more of a flow, the coir logs are acting to stop that, and it's beginning to pool. So not only are they good at doing that, but they're also incredibly good at building sediment. So when we began using these coir logs, we experimented a bit by putting them into gullies as well as on those flatter areas of bare peat. And they had a substantial impact. They started collecting huge amounts of sediment in a really short amount of time. And as you can see here, before long, the bottom layer of coir had actually become completely submerged by the sediment. In fact, there was so much sediment coming through this gully, the coir clearly needed more support, and we put in a couple of stone dams to help. But even these have actually started to overtop with water and sediment. So it's just incredible. If you just look at that picture and imagine all of that sediment would have been going straight down the hill, down into the wharf, actually. So we've managed to stop it, and that's just been in a matter of months that those interventions have worked. And in wetter areas where the coir has been for about 2 years, we're beginning to see the sphagnum and the cotton grasses coming back. So all in all, I'm actually quite a fan of these coir logs, but we are looking now for a local alternative because the coir itself actually comes from Sri Lanka. So it would be great if we could come up with a local material that we could use here, and we're looking into that at the moment. So watch this space. Right, I'm going to try and show you another video now, which will again hopefully give you an idea of what happens with the coir and what life is like out on the moor when we start using helicopters.
On Fleet Moss today, and it's going to be a really busy day. As you can see behind me, the helicopter is on standby, and there's 500 tons of stone busy being sorted to get into the bucket for the chopper to carry out onto the site. 333 odd stone dams that are going to be built in the next few days. And you can also see a load of coir behind me. That's also got to get up. So we've got a busy few days ahead. Hopefully the weather's going to be kind to us. At the moment it's really windy, so not quite sure how much we're going to get done today, but hopefully, fingers crossed. It's the coir that we're starting to fly out. There's about 1,000 logs. The guys are just getting into position behind me. Still very windy, but yeah, we're off. So the coir's all been done and they're getting ready now to load all the stone. Really smooth operation going on here. Very impressed.
So as well as the hydrology, which will actually lead to a kind of natural revegetation, as you saw there with all the cotton grasses and the sphagnums coming back, we also need to actively revegetate sites. So as I mentioned at the start, peat without vegetation is unstable, and it'll be really easily eroded by wind and water and livestock poaching, creating these very deeply cut hags and gully sides. So what you're seeing here is a typical eroded landscape, which is full of hags. These will have to be stabilized before any vegetation can grow on them. And the first step for doing this is to reprofile the slopes to a stable angle, and where possible, take that stabilized slope and do what we call turving. So this involves actually taking turf, excuse me, from the top of the hag or the gully, scraping it delicately off the surface and replacing it on the bare peat. It's an incredible process, and it eventually leaves the slope looking like this. And as you can see, it just doesn't look like the hag was there. It's a really successful and extraordinary technique. So I'm going to show you another little video which is actually embedded in the presentation. So the quality isn't great, and it's also not great because I took this about 4 or 5 years ago on my very, very first day that I was a peatland restoration assistant. And when I saw this for the first time, I was completely blown away. I just thought it was the most amazing thing ever, that you could have this apparently clumsy, massive bit of machinery that was just so delicately scooping up the top of the turf there, just the top layer, and then amazingly just placing it so accurately down the slope before pressing it in, and just creating this suddenly from bare peat to this sort of vegetated slope. I just thought that was wonderful, and yeah, so I wanted to share that with you. So I still think that that whole process is magic. How you can go from something that looks like this to something that looks like that. Just doesn't look like the digger's been there. And we're doing this technique more and more now on our sites, and we'll quite often reprofile and cover about 50% or more of the bare peat on exposed slopes. But it's actually not a technique that you can do everywhere. Sometimes in some areas, the turf just isn't suitable, there isn't enough of it, or you would just end up damaging the area more. So we will still reprofile the slope so that it still gets to a stable angle, which makes it much easier to vegetate, but we won't be able to turf it. And in these cases, we actually end up using what we call brash. So brash is commonly made up of heather and mosses and dwarf shrubs, which have all been cut from a donor site. And its composition is really, really vital to the success of revegetation. It needs to have this kind of mix of younger heather, dwarf shrubs, cotton grasses, and most critically, moss. If possible, sphagnum moss, but any kind of moss that has that sort of water retaining ability is so, so important. It just provides a wonderful seed bed, and it helps to stick to the peat once it's applied. And that's what it looks like once it's been put on. And as well as the brash, what we add in is a mix of dwarf shrub and grass seed, along with lime, which we need to reduce the pH of the peat, which has just become too acidic. And we also put on a bit of fertilizer just to give it a bit of fizz and encourage growth. And there you go, that's the sort of landscape that we end up with when it's covered with brash. Then finally, we also plant cotton grass plugs, and these have been grown in a nursery, and we'll also then plant sphagnum, which sometimes is grown in a nursery, or we've harvested it from other areas of the site or a different site and replanted it. So all of that is what will get us from this picture to this picture in about 2 years. So, as you can appreciate, peatland restoration is an enormous, expensive and long-term undertaking, but its rewards far outweigh the costs. Globally, peatlands contain 550 gigatons of carbon. That's more than twice the carbon stored in all of the world's forest. As I said at the beginning, these are our Amazon. 70% of the UK's drinking water comes from the upland peatlands. When healthy, they help slow the flow of the runoff from our hills into the catchments, protecting our rivers and towns from flash flooding. They provide a home for some of our most iconic species, many of which are endangered or threatened due to a declining habitat. And then stored away in that peat is information, countless bits of pollen, microbes, and artifacts that tell the history of life on this planet. There's still so much of that it can teach us, so we mustn't lose it. And yet peat continues to be abused. The most common abuse is the digging up of peat for compost. Commercial peat extraction occurs mainly on raised bogs, And currently, nearly 3 million cubic meters of peat are sold for horticultural use every year in the UK. 1/3 of that comes from UK peatlands. When it comes to be used by gardeners, it's the equivalent to half a century's growth of peat destroyed every year. And while there's been a directive from government to gardening centres to phase out peat since 2011, it's voluntary. And as you'll know from visits to most gardening centres, it's still very much for sale. There's a similar target to phase out trade in peat use by 2030, but as yet, there's been little progress. Business as usual has prevailed on sites milled for peat, both in the UK and overseas. The Royal Horticultural Society's research has demonstrated that 97% of their plants can grow on peat alternatives, and that Royal Botanic Gardens Kew is peat-free. So alternatives do exist, but research shows 1/3 of gardeners couldn't source peat-free alternatives in their local garden centre. So we need more effective action. And if you can, it'd be great if you could start voting with your feet, and as well as avoiding buying these products, perhaps going a step further and having a conversation with your local centres to ask for more peat-free alternatives and to stop stocking the shelves with peat products. Bizarrely, this isn't the only peat product we need to look out for. Only a few miles away from where I live, there's a very lovely farm shop that stocks this. It looks delicious until you see that it's smoked over Yorkshire peat, and with the wonderful strapline, "Discover the moors." I'm afraid it's not something that I'd find very easy to swallow, if you excuse the pun. And then in another farm shop also down the road from me, they're selling so-called eco-friendly peat briquettes. And I've looked online and there are hundreds of suppliers for this across the country, with plenty of extraordinary claims that they're eco-friendly and a good choice for the ecologically conscious consumer. No, but it gets even stranger. And recently I found this. This company says, it brings you the healing abilities of 7,500-year-old untouched and unique peat. We use the best peat available in the world for our products, untouched by man. Not really a claim I think I'd be proud of. And products like this are everywhere. And my message is, let's try and keep it all in the ground, shall we? So I think my big ask would be to spread awareness of the importance of peat and why it's so much better for every living being if we can just keep it in the ground. Talk to your garden centres, your farm shops, your local MP, and let's give peat a chance. So I'd like to end with just another short video, if I may. wanted to say thanks for watching, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming today. And I just also wanted to say a thank you as well to all the organisations who support our work, some of whom you can see here. We are a really true partnership, and we work very closely with individuals within all of these organisations, and also with all the landowners and tenant farmers who are lucky enough to have peatlands in their charge. We've worked really closely with them, and I'd like to say a special thank you actually to them for taking this journey with us and helping to give peat a chance.